The historical track record for automotive startups in the United States is extremely bad. The only two American car companies in history that have not gone bankrupt are Ford and Tesla.
Traditional automakers followed Elon Musk in betting big on EVs. In 2021, GM announced that it would end production of all of its gas and diesel-powered vehicles by 2035 and go fully electric by 2040.
Well, I think the car companies were responding with enthusiasm and hope for the new vehicles.
Mary Nichols is a believer in EVs. During her tenure as the chair of California's Air Resources Board, she implemented the state's landmark greenhouse gas emission standards.
Here in California, the sales rates are almost equal now to gasoline-powered vehicles. In other places, the penetration is going more slowly.
As much as California may be the EV leader, the rest of the country doesn't seem to be keeping up. It turns out that the EV bandwagon needs some support from an infrastructure for charging the cars that just isn't there yet.
It's just that the hope had been that they would really overtake gasoline vehicles faster than they did. And it turned out that there was more reluctance on the part of people, especially in parts of the country where they don't have the infrastructure in place for supporting those vehicles, particularly where the electric utilities didn't step up as fast to provide charging, where building owners in some cases were reluctant. It takes a lot of changes in the system to match what has been achieved over 100 years.
BNEF estimates that the 14 automakers who set ambitious EV goals for 2030 have trimmed back their expectations from 27 million vehicles that year to 23.7 million. One of those pumping the brakes on EVs is Ford, which shelved its plans for an all-electric, three-row SUV last year. CEO Jim Farley took us through some of the challenges several months ago.
Well, first of all, the electric market in the U.S. is about 11% of the market. In California, it's a third of the sales. So it's a huge market and is growing really fast. And competitively, globally, I think what's happened is we're in the mainstream customer. And the mainstream customer is totally different than the early adopters. The early adopters, we didn't need to convince them to go charge, or they didn't really worry about resale value, but the customers now do. And that means on us, we have to really transform our cost.
And now it's not just the lack of charging stations that's slowing the move to EVs. We have a new administration in Washington that appears to be reversing the nation's pro-EV policy.
We ended the last administration's insane electric vehicle mandate, saving our auto workers and companies from economic destruction.
It's a trend that I think is well underway, and it's going to continue. I do think that the election sent a message that in some states in particular, this is like a political issue, which certainly is not helpful for any industry. I don't think vehicles are partisan. I don't think there are Democrat or Republican vehicles. You're just looking for the best vehicle that you can get for your money.
Whether powered by electricity or gasoline, the bandwagon of DEI was moving full speed ahead in much of corporate America when BlackRock CEO Larry Fink wrote to shareholders in 2021 that he had a, quote, long-term strategy aimed at improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. 4 years later, Fink was writing to BlackRock's staff saying it was, quote, committed to creating a culture that welcomes diverse people and perspectives, but acknowledging, quote, significant changes to U.S. legal and policy environment related to DEI.
Now, the real question is, what are the policies and practices that organizations should have in place in order for the organization to function effectively? And we spend a lot of time talking to employees and looking at trends across corporations.
Tracy Sitzman is professor of management at the University of Colorado, Denver, and has studied DEI policies throughout corporate America, why we have them, and which ones work and don't work.
And the clear and consistent trend that we're seeing is that employees want to work for an employer that's authentic in their approach to dealing with their employees.
Sitzman's studies have led her to the conclusion that whether a DEI program makes a company run better and ultimately make more money depends on how it is done.
One of the most popular programs for enhancing diversity and inclusion has been diversity training. And this is an example of a program that can work really well or can undermine our workforce. People work hard, they diversify the workforce, and it's successful. By contrast, many corporations implement diversity and inclusion training, and they have a legal undertone as part of the training. So they teach people just how questionable their behavior can become before it crosses the line to being illegal. And when we implement training with an illegal undertone, it actually results in people's behavior becoming more questionable.
But can a program targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion succeed without focusing on identity politics, without setting targets that become a form of quotas? Robbie Starbuck is a faith-based investor who has championed the cause of cutting back on DEI programs.
Even if you wanted to pretend DEI was ultimately a good thing, how can we do the things that we proclaim to want to do without violating the law? And at the end of the day, if you look at these policies like racial quotas for hiring, it's not possible. You can't have a racial quota for hiring and not violate the law. But therein lies the real core of almost every DEI policy in America, is that we should look at people and judge them by their skin tone, which is diametrically opposed to the ideas of the civil rights movement, which was that we're not supposed to judge people by their skin tone. We're actually supposed to look at them as an individual and say, your value lies in your actions, what you can do, your merit. And so that's what we want to see.
Sitzman may not favor quotas, but she readily admits that it's awfully hard to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion without setting numerical targets.
What strategic goal would you set in a corporation where you would not measure it? It just doesn't make sense, right? Without a goal, without some numbers behind something, we don't know how well we're doing, and therefore we're not going to be managing the process towards hitting that target.
In addition to the bandwagons heading toward EVs and DEI, a third movement was Wall Street's migration south to the sunnier and less regulated pastures of Miami. It began earlier, but when the pandemic hit in 2020, its speed picked up. From 2020 to 2021, Florida experienced the largest uptick in registered independent advisors and broker-dealers of any state. And by 2022, it had become home to Elliott Management, Citadel, Icon Capital, and expanded footprints from the likes of J.P. Morgan. Michael Schvo is a luxury real estate developer with properties in Miami and New York.
What's interesting, because that moment in Miami was an extremely surreal experience. You'd have billionaires roaming around North Bay Road, Palm Island, Star Island, looking for homes and literally willing to pay anything just to find a house on the water. Because the idea was nobody with means wanted to stay at home locked up here in New York City. And obviously today, hindsight, things haven't really worked out exactly like that. People moved to Miami. Miami turned to be a real city because you have now real restaurants, you have real people, you have education, you have culture there. But it didn't take the place of New York like a lot of people predicted.
The growing pains come in the form of lack of schools, unfinished offices, and traffic.
Miami has an issue because of schools. It doesn't have enough schools, and that's probably the reason Miami's slowing. There are a lot of companies that would move down if they could get their employees' kids into schools, which is impossible. So you got to be very bullish on Citadel, which obviously left Chicago. I mean, they alone have decided they're going to make Miami into the financial capital of the United States, and they have the power to do that.
So there's a lack of schools in Miami. There's no doubt about that, and that's kind of the main issue. Infrastructure depends where, right? Miami Beach, sections of Miami Beach are okay, but because you have houses there, there's not real main infrastructure issues. The infrastructure issues really became more apparent in transportation. Crossway didn't have enough lanes. There was a lot of traffic. There was congestion because the amount of cars all of a sudden in Miami, people that are coming to work in Miami, is something that Miami has not experienced. And the acceleration of growth was so quick that they did not have the infrastructure. They're catching up now, but again, now less people are working there. So both the infrastructure is catching up, but we're seeing less people there, at least on a permanent base, from what we thought we're going to have, post-COVID.
I wonder the role of demographics and people moving in both the commercial side, the office, and also the residential that you're involved in. Because if you look at the numbers overall, California's losing people. Illinois is losing people. New York losing people. Florida gaining people. Texas gaining people. Does that tell you something about those real estate markets?
Well, yes and no, because it depends who you're gaining. Because if we're talking about commercial real estate, the reality is, are we losing the companies? Are we losing the workforce that's here? Or are you losing, people that are retired and not working and decided it's better to retire in Florida because the tax situation is better there, which is a lot of the reason that you're seeing, people move out of New York and California. There's obviously tax incentive to move to some of the southern states. So I don't think we're not seeing the movement of the true workforce.
Those moving to Miami may have gotten a better climate, but they weren't looking for much different in the spaces they occupy.
So the difference between tenancy in Miami and New York, and again, as I said, Shvo operates only in the super prime real estate. So for us, we focus on the psychographic of the tenant. And in our mind, the psychographic of a JP Morgan, is no different in New York than it is in Miami. Maybe the office needs are a bit different, a little bit more outdoor space in Miami. There's that desire to have kind of the indoor-outdoor spaces. But the reality is that you don't change your mindset from a service perspective, from a space perspective, from an environment, because you're in Miami or New York or in San Francisco to that effect.
Whether it's picking up stakes and moving to Miami, or ditching our gas-powered cars, or changing the very nature of our workforce, there's all sorts of good ideas out there, ideas that may make sense. But no matter how good the idea, it pays to have a pretty good sense where that bandwagon is headed before we jump onto it.